The silver trays gleamed like small mirrors, reflecting fragments of a world she would never belong to. Ruth Carter, the head maid of the Sterling Foundation, moved quietly through the marble corridors, invisible by design. The guests, politicians, donors, and executives, barely noticed her except when their glasses ran dry. "She's efficient," one of them whispered approvingly, as if discussing a machine. To them, Ruth was furniture, necessary, functional, unseen. What they didn't know was that Ruth Carter once held a master's degree in public finance from Howard University, had interned with the Department of Treasury, and published research on nonprofit corruption. But after her whistleblower report exposed financial discrimination at a major corporation, she'd been blacklisted, her reputation smeared, her credentials erased by a network of powerful people who never forgave her for speaking up. She became what they wanted her to be: invisible. A maid, a servant, a black woman in uniform seen only when needed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very elites who destroyed her career now employed her to polish their trophies. She was standing in the West Gallery of the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala when her breath caught. A new painting had been unveiled that night, a portrait titled "The Founder's Legacy." It depicted a smiling white boy, maybe 12 years old, in a neat blue uniform. His nameplate beneath read, "Young Victor Sterling, our inspiration." Ruth's tray tilted slightly, champagne flutes trembling. The room blurred, voices dimmed. She stepped closer to the canvas, heart hammering. The boy's eyes, those gray-blue eyes, were unmistakable. She knew that face. "Sir," her voice cracked, trembling between disbelief and fury. "Sir, this boy lived with me in the orphanage." The words tore through the gala's artificial calm like glass shattering on marble. Conversations froze. Heads turned. A waiter dropped a spoon. The music stopped mid-note. At the center of the room, Richard Hartwell Sterling, CEO of Sterling International and heir to a billion-dollar philanthropic empire, looked up from his circle of investors. His smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "I beg your pardon," he said, voice smooth, amused even. Ruth realized everyone was watching. Every camera, every eye. She took a breath. "That boy, Victor Sterling, he lived at St. Margaret's Orphanage in Alabama. I took care of him. He wasn't born a Sterling." A flicker of discomfort passed through the crowd. The man's jaw tightened. "You must be mistaken," he said coolly. "My son was adopted legally, long before my late wife passed. Now please, someone take this woman back to service staff." The security guards hesitated, unsure. Ruth lowered her tray slowly. "You erased his records," she whispered, voice steady now. "You erased everything that proved he came from us. Why?" That word, erased, hung in the air like smoke. Across the room, Victoria Sterling's portrait, his late wife, stared down in painted serenity, while Richard's eyes hardened. "Miss Carter," he said, dropping the pretense of charm, "you've clearly misunderstood your place here." And there it was, the arrogance she had been studying for months. The same man who'd buried careers, falsified donations, and bought silence with checks bearing his foundation's name. He believed she was beneath him, a maid, a voice too small to matter. But Ruth Carter wasn't speaking out of shock. This was calculation. The outburst wasn't a mistake. It was a spark, deliberately struck to see how quickly the flames would spread. She already knew what she'd find when she followed the money behind the portrait's unveiling. The offshore trusts, the forged adoption papers, the charitable funds that never reached the children they were meant to help. She had spent 3 years polishing his empire's floors and watching its foundations rot. And now, with the boy's painted face smiling down like a ghost of truth, Ruth Carter finally saw where to aim her demolition charges. The incident spread through the Sterling Foundation like static, whispered, distorted, and dangerous. By the next morning, every employee in the tower had heard about The maid who lost her mind at the gala. Richard Sterling didn't call for her firing immediately. That was too obvious, too small for a man who played chess with reputations. Instead, he summoned her, publicly, to the boardroom on the 47th floor, during a staff-wide meeting. He wanted to humiliate her where every eye could see. When Ruth entered, the room was already full, executives in tailored suits, assistants with tablets poised, and a few select journalists invited under the guise of transparency. She could feel their eyes sweep over her uniform, plain black dress, white collar, polished shoes, before dismissing her entirely. At the head of the table, Richard Sterling smiled thinly. "Ms. Carter," he said, "thank you for joining us. We thought it would be instructive to clarify a few things about your rather dramatic claim last night." His voice was silk, stretched over steel. Ruth folded her hands calmly. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the giant digital screen behind him. It displayed the same portrait from the gala. The boy's painted smile projected 12 feet high. "This," he said, "is my late son, Victor, a child I adopted out of love and loss. Ms. Carter here believes she once cared for him in an orphanage." The room chuckled politely, like an audience cued to laugh. Richard continued, "Tell us, Ms. Carter, since you claim such familiarity, perhaps you can remind us what color his eyes were." The cruelty in his tone was surgical. Ruth met his gaze without blinking. "Gray-blue," she said. "Same as yours, but his weren't cold." The laughter froze. Richard's jaw stiffened. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped, just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath. Calculating, cornered, furious. He leaned forward. "You have a sharp memory for a maid, perhaps too sharp. Tell me, did they teach you that in housekeeping school?" The crowd tittered again, relieved to see the hierarchy reasserted. Cameras flashed. Someone from PR whispered, "This will make a great internal memo on loyalty and professionalism." Ruth said nothing. Her silence unnerved him more than protest would have. Then came the fatal moment, the weapon transfer, the arrogance that would become his undoing. Richard turned to the journalists. "You see, this is precisely why our foundation's work is so important. We uplift the less fortunate, those forgotten by the system. But unfortunately, some people mistake generosity for weakness." He tapped his tablet, projecting a confidential financial summary onto the wall, a gesture meant to impress. "For example, here's where our funding goes: clean water initiatives, orphanage grants, education programs. It's all transparent." The screen flashed through rows of numbers, project codes, and transfer records. But in his performance, he scrolled too far, past the public page into the hidden ledger. The one tagged orphanage allocations, restricted. For exactly 3 seconds, the internal accounts were visible, showing millions funneled through offshore charities into shell companies under the initials VS Holdings. Ruth didn't move, but the small recording device disguised in her cleaning badge caught every frame, every word. "Transparency," he said again, unaware. "That's what we stand for," the journalists applauded politely. The meeting adjourned. Richard Sterling believed he had crushed her, a fool's delusion of superiority. He didn't know that in those 3 seconds, he had handed her the first detonator. As the crowd dispersed, one woman lingered near the exit. Amelia Cho, a young investigative journalist for the Financial Mirror. She had noticed the flicker of panic that crossed Ruth's face at the sight of those accounts. Not fear, but recognition. She caught Ruth's eye briefly, offering a subtle nod. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her badge. She had the recording, the timestamp, the proof of misused orphanage funds, and most importantly, she had the public footage of her own humiliation. A performance that now doubled as evidence. In the elevator down, she whispered to herself, "You taught me where the fault lines are, Richard." Her voice was steady, controlled. She understood the architecture of power better than anyone in that room. She'd studied it, lived under it, and now she would dismantle it brick by brick. By the time the elevator doors opened onto the ground floor, Ruth Carter was no longer the maid who'd shouted at a portrait. She was the architect, and the demolition plan had officially begun. For the next 92 days, Ruth Carter vanished, at least in the eyes of the people who mattered. She still arrived every morning in her pressed black uniform, hair tied, name badge pinned. She still pushed her cart through the Sterling Foundation's gleaming corridors, her silence blending with the hum of corporate ambition. To everyone else, she was the maid who had embarrassed herself at the gala, pitied by some, dismissed by most. But that invisibility was her weapon. Richard Sterling's world ran on the assumption that people like her didn't listen, didn't understand, didn't see. He had no idea that beneath her tray of cleaning supplies was a tablet disguised as a supply logbook, its camera recording everything she dusted, wiped, or pretended to polish. Leveraging invisibility, the first phase was access. Ruth understood that secrets in corporations don't live in vaults. They live in habits. Executives left open laptops when they went for lunch. Assistants gossiped near copy rooms. Shredders jammed. Bins overflowed. One night, while cleaning the executive lounge, she noticed a phone left charging on the bar. A message flashing across the screen. Wire completed. VS Holdings confirmed. She didn't touch the device, just noted the timestamp and sender ID. The next morning, she rewired one of the building's cleaning drones, using her old Treasury coding skills to redirect its camera feed to her hidden server. Every evening, it swept through the 47th floor, capturing discarded drafts, hand-scribbled notes, and fragments of emails projected on screens. By the end of the first month, she had terabytes of fragments, numbers, names, partial transactions, on their own, meaningless. Together, they whispered something darker. But she needed help to turn whispers into proof. The catalyst, her first ally, was Amelia Cho, the journalist who had seen through the performance in the boardroom. Amelia met Ruth at a quiet diner near the river, away from the tower's cameras. "You're risking everything," Amelia warned, voice low. "Sterling's lawyers eat people alive." Ruth stirred her coffee slowly. "They already took everything. I'm just reclaiming what's mine." "What do you want from me?" "Validation," Ruth said simply. "I'll bring you the data. You bring me the authentication. And when it's ready, we go public." Amelia hesitated, studying the woman across from her. The calm precision, the absence of fear. "You're not just cleaning floors, are you?" Ruth smiled faintly. "No, I'm cleaning history." Over the following weeks, Amelia became her catalyst, the outside pressure that would transform evidence into explosion. Using encrypted drop boxes, Ruth sent her raw files, labeled only by code names: Gray, Blue, Orphan, Mirror. Amelia's newsroom verified one after another. Shell accounts linked to stolen grants, fake invoices under the guise of adoption outreach, and offshore transfers routed through a humanitarian fund registered in the Cayman Islands. 3. The evidence dossier Ruth divided her findings into 3 categories, each one a brick in the tower she would bring down. A. The prejudice pattern. The Foundation's hiring data was supposed to be anonymized, but Ruth knew the internal system's weaknesses. Using credentials she borrowed from an inattentive HR director's unlocked screen, she extracted 5 years of employment records. The statistics were brutal. 83% of senior staff were white. Only 4% of promotions involved employees of color, all in administrative roles. Termination memos used identical phrasing for underperformance, usually issued within 90 days of hiring. Black or Latinx candidates. But the real smoking proof came from an audio file Recorded while Ruth polished the brass fixtures outside the private conference room. Richard Sterling's voice, smooth as ever. We can't have people like that representing the brand at investor events. Optics matter, you understand, the board member replied quietly. But the numbers? Then change the numbers. It was said casually, like one might discuss rearranging furniture. But those 5 words, then change the numbers, would later echo across every news feed in the country. B. The financial crime. The shell accounts were trickier. Sterling's inner circle believed their schemes invisible, hidden behind layers of offshore trusts and false charities. But Ruth had once audited nonprofits for a living. She understood how donations could be laundered through benevolent programs. Using her drone's footage and a captured USB backup from the accounting department, she reconstructed the paper trail. $12.6 million in orphan care grants routed to VS Holdings Ltd, a dummy corporation in Belize, matching withdrawals from Sterling's private art trust, used to purchase luxury paintings in honor of deceased children. One transaction, labeled Project Haven, directed to a Cayman account under the codename Victor S13. The code was unmistakable. Victor Sterling, the boy in the portrait, had been converted into a ghost ledger, a symbol for siphoning money meant for real orphans. Amelia's team cross-referenced the names. Every project corresponded to a shuttered orphanage or collapsed education fund. The foundation wasn't saving children, it was burying them in paperwork. C. The smoking gun. The final piece came from an unlikely source. The moral witness. Her name was Mrs. Eloise Daniels, 81 years old, the retired director of St. Margaret's Orphanage. Ruth found her living quietly in Georgia, surviving on a modest pension. When Ruth showed her the portrait photo, Eloise's eyes filled with tears. "That's Michael," she whispered. That boy's name was Michael Reed. He wasn't a Sterling. He was one of ours. Eloise produced a copy of an old adoption record, stamped, signed, dated. It showed the child's transfer to the custody of Richard H. Sterling, funded by a special private grant. But scrawled in red ink across the margin were 3 damning words. Documents altered post-signature. When Amelia's legal team verified it, they discovered the digital archives for that year had been deliberately corrupted. Metadata wiped. Entries missing. Someone inside the foundation had destroyed the original records to rewrite a legacy. That someone, Ruth realized, was Richard himself. The calculated timing every. Demolition requires precision. Ruth and Amelia planned their strike to coincide with Sterling's Global Humanitarian Awards ceremony, the event that would crown him as the modern saint of philanthropy. World leaders, donors, and cameras would be present. But Ruth didn't want mere scandal. She wanted structural collapse, an exposure so undeniable that the system protecting him would implode alongside him. They prepared a synchronized release. Amelia's outlet would publish the investigative feature online, timed to hit the front page exactly 6 minutes after the ceremony began. Simultaneously, Ruth would trigger an encrypted broadcast from the Foundation's internal servers, projecting the evidence, audio, documents, and financial maps onto the screens in the event hall itself. And the closing blow, a live recording from Ruth's badge cam, showing Richard's voice from the boardroom, saying, "Then change the numbers." To pull it off, Ruth needed access to the server room, the digital heart of the Foundation. She volunteered for the night shift during the week of the event. No one questioned her. She was invisible after all. Using her old cybersecurity training, she slipped a device into the system, small enough to fit inside a cleaning bottle. It created a backdoor channel linking the internal broadcast to Amelia's encrypted stream. The device blinked once, armed. For 3 nights, she barely slept. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the HVAC, the creak of marble floors, her own heartbeat counting down the hours. She often stood before the boy's portrait in the empty gallery, studying the painted smile that had started it all. "You didn't die," she whispered. "They erased you, but I'll put you back where you belong, in the record." The night before the ceremony, she received a text from Amelia. "Tomorrow, 8:43 p.m. sharp. Be ready to speak." Ruth deleted the message immediately, replaced her phone's SIM card, and pressed her uniform one last time. She looked into the mirror. Not the maid now, not the servant, but the strategist behind an empire's collapse. Richard Sterling had built his fortune on the backs of the unseen. He had weaponized charity, commodified compassion, and convinced the world he was saving it. Tomorrow, his own illusion would devour him, and when the lights went out, and the truth filled every screen in the hall, the world would finally see what Ruth Carter had seen all along. Not a philanthropist, but an architect of exploitation. The grand atrium of the Sterling Foundation glittered under chandeliers the size of planets. Every surface, glass, gold, and marble, reflected wealth as religion. The Global Humanitarian Awards ceremony had drawn an audience of world leaders, CEOs, and journalists from every continent. Cameras hovered like insects, catching every smile, every handshake, every illusion. At the center of it all stood Richard Hartwell Sterling, draped in his signature navy suit, rehearsed humility masking centuries of inherited power. Tonight, he would accept the award that officially anointed him as the conscience of modern capitalism. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "please welcome the visionary who turned compassion into action, Mr. Richard Sterling." Applause swelled like thunder. He stepped up to the podium, eyes scanning the crowd, finding validation in every flash. He began his speech, fluid, rehearsed, flawless. "In a world divided by greed, we must remember that compassion is the only true currency." The audience leaned in, spellbound, and at the back of the hall, unnoticed by security, Ruth Carter wheeled in a tray of crystal glasses, her uniform immaculate, her posture unshaken. She moved with the silence of someone who had already outlived fear. As Richard's speech soared into moral platitudes, Ruth paused beside the audiovisual console. A single keystroke was all it would take. Her thumb hovered over the button hidden in her cleaning badge. On the massive screen behind Richard, his own portrait filled the frame, smiling, confident, saintly. Then it glitched. A flicker, a heartbeat. Then the portrait was replaced by a live feed, a folder titled The Architect Files. The room froze. The file opened itself. Rows of documents, spreadsheets, and audio recordings filled the screen. Then came the voice, his voice, from the recording Ruth had captured weeks ago. "We can't have people like that representing the brand at investor events. Optics matter, you understand. But the numbers, then change the numbers." The words thundered through the hall, echoing against marble and money. A murmur rippled through the audience, then gasps. Then the rustle of panic. "Turn it off!" Richard barked, but the technician was frozen, hands trembling over the keyboard. The system was locked. A second file opened. Orphanage allocations, restricted. Transaction logs rolled across the screens, revealing millions diverted through shell accounts. VS Holdings, Latwitinated, Project Haven, Victor S13. Each transfer stamped with Sterling's digital signature. Then came the image that silenced even the whispers. The portrait of the boy, side by side with an old orphanage record. The name below, Michael Reed. "That boy," a voice in the audience whispered. "He wasn't even his son." At that exact moment, Amelia Cho's online exposé went live. Notifications began pinging across phones, journalists' faces lighting up with breaking alerts. The world outside was watching now. Richard's composure cracked. "This is false, fabricated," he stammered. "A malicious act by a disgruntled employee." And then a voice rose from the back. Ruth stepped forward, setting down her tray. "Employee?" she repeated softly, her voice carrying through the microphone still in her pocket. "Is that all I am to you, Mr. Sterling?" The cameras swung toward her. The lights caught her face, steady, calm, radiant with years of contained truth. Richard's expression twisted. "You again? Security!" But the guards hesitated. The world was watching. Ruth took another step forward. "My name," she said clearly, "is Dr. Ruth Carter. I hold a master's in public finance, a PhD in nonprofit systems, and I once audited organizations like yours for the U.S. Treasury, before your company blacklisted me for exposing discrimination." A collective gasp spread through the audience. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You remember that, don't you?" she continued, voice steady as a blade. "You buried my career because I was a black woman who refused to stay quiet. You told me I'd never work in this city again. And you were right, until I took a job cleaning your floors." She turned toward the crowd. "And from those floors, I watched how your empire was built. On lies, on theft, on children who never got the help your foundation promised." Behind her, the screen displayed an image of Mrs. Eloise Daniels, the elderly orphanage director, holding up the original adoption record. Her recorded statement played over the speakers. "That boy was Michael Reed. They altered the papers after I signed them. They erased him." The room erupted. Flashes, shouts, reporters pushing forward. Ruth's badge camera streamed the chaos live. Every screen in the building, every digital billboard outside, was broadcasting the truth. Richard stumbled backward, pale, sweating. This is criminal intrusion." Ruth met his eyes one last time. "No, Richard, this is transparency." From the hall entrance, 2 federal agents stepped forward, Amelia at their side, press badge gleaming. "Richard Hartwell Sterling," one agent announced, "you are under investigation for financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. You will come with us." The applause that followed wasn't joyous. It was justice being exhaled. Years of suppressed truth finding its sound. As the agents led him away, Richard's voice cracked into desperation. "You can't do this. I made you people. I built this city's conscience." Ruth's final words followed him through the marble corridors. "You built a lie. I just showed them the architecture." Epilogue. The system rebuilt. Resolution. 6 months later, the Sterling Foundation was gone, its name stripped from every building, its assets seized and redirected to a new nonprofit, the Reed Initiative, named after the boy who had been erased. At the first press conference, Dr. Ruth Carter, now Director of Global Compliance and Ethics, stood beside Amelia Cho. "Justice," she said, "isn't vengeance. It's restoration. For every voice silenced, there must be one that keeps speaking." Her foundation's first act funded scholarships for children, from orphanages and underprivileged backgrounds, especially those of color, ensuring that invisibility would never again be a barrier to brilliance. Richard Sterling, once untouchable, now awaited trial in federal custody. His properties were sold to repay stolen grants. His name became a warning in every business ethics course. Ruth often returned to the gallery where it had all begun. The boy's portrait still hung there, but now the plaque beneath had been changed. Michael Reed, in memory of those erased, and those who refused to forget. She stood quietly before it, the hum of the city outside fading into silence. For a moment, she thought of her old life, the humiliation, the years of invisibility. Then she smiled. Some demolitions destroy buildings. Others destroy empires. Hers had rebuilt something better. And as the light caught her reflection in the glass, Dr. Ruth Carter finally saw herself clearly. Not as the maid, not as the outcast, but as the architect of truth.